Farming is remembered as the invention that fed civilization, but the first fields may also have divided the human body. Men and women could eat from the same harvest, yet their skeletons did not always carry the same history. Labor, diet, pregnancy, disease, and social roles could leave different patterns in bone long before anyone wrote them down. Settled life grew above the soil while two physical histories formed beneath the skin. Why did farming change men's and women's bodies differently? Long before written history, before laws were carved into stone, and before kings gave names to kingdoms, human beings began to live in places that lasted. Walls were repaired instead of abandoned. Hearths were used again and again. Grain was stored for seasons that had not yet arrived. Paths formed between houses, fields, water sources, and burial grounds. From a distance, this change can look simple, almost gentle. People stopped moving so often, planted seeds, kept animals nearby, and built villages that endured. Yet beneath those houses, in graves cut into the same earth that had been cultivated, another history was taking shape. The bones of the dead preserved quiet traces of how life had passed through the body. They carried signs of growth, strain, illness, healing, diet, movement, and age. None of these traces speak clearly on their own, and none can tell us exactly what one person did from morning to night. But when many skeletons from the same community are studied together, patterns sometimes begin to appear. Some bodies show heavier use of certain limbs. Some teeth carry more decay or wear. Some adults seem to have experienced stress during childhood. Some individuals were buried with objects, while others were not. And in a number of early farming communities, the patterns found in male and female bodies were not always the same. The difference was not universal, and it did not follow one rule across every region. Still, its presence raises a difficult question. If people shared the same settlement, drank from the same streams, and depended on the same harvests, why did their bodies sometimes preserve different histories? The answer cannot be found in one bone, one village, or one idea about the past. Early farming did not create a single way of life. It unfolded slowly, unevenly, and differently in separate parts of the world. Some communities relied heavily on crops. Others continued hunting, fishing, or gathering wild foods. Some villages remained small. Others grew more crowded. The first people who lived with cultivation were still close to the long human beginning, when survival depended on flexible movement, broad knowledge of landscapes, and the ability to change with the seasons. Their bodies had been shaped by that deeper past, but their daily routines were beginning to change. A person who once walked across a wide territory might now spend more time near a house, a grinding stone, an animal enclosure, or a field. A source of food that once had to be searched for might now have to be planted, protected, harvested, processed, and stored. These changes affected everyone, but not necessarily in identical ways. Age mattered. Local customs mattered. Pregnancy and childcare mattered. The location of water, the design of tools, the size of the settlement, and the foods considered suitable for different people may all have mattered as well. Archaeology can sometimes reveal the results of these pressures, but it rarely preserves the full arrangement of daily life that produced them. This is why the bodies beneath early villages are so important and so difficult to interpret. They are not simple records of progress or decline. They are fragments of lives lived inside a transformation that no one person could have understood in full. Above ground, farming was changing the landscape. Below ground, human skeletons were beginning to record changes that may have divided experience by sex, age, work, and social position. The mystery begins there, not with a conclusion, but with the realization that the first permanent settlements may have held more than one bodily history at the same time. Once archaeologists begin comparing many bodies from the same early settlement, the silence of a single skeleton becomes a little less complete. No bone can describe a person's daily routine, yet groups of bones may reveal that people living side by side did not always experience the same physical conditions. The differences can appear in several places. Long bones may preserve changes related to repeated loading and movement. Joints may show wear, although wear alone cannot identify one particular task. Teeth may carry decay, heavy abrasion, loss before death, or lines formed while the body was still growing. Adult height and the proportions of the skeleton may also reflect a mixture of inheritance, childhood nutrition, illness, and the demands placed on a developing body. Some signs appear only after years of repeated strain, while others were formed during short periods of difficulty in childhood. A healed injury can show that a person survived trauma, but it cannot explain how the injury occurred. A small difference between two groups may be meaningful, or it may reflect age, sample size, burial customs, or the simple fact that only some people were preserved and found. When these traces are compared, male and female skeletons sometimes form different patterns, but the meaning of those patterns is rarely simple. A stronger arm bone does not reveal who planted seed or ground grain. A damaged joint does not tell us whether its owner carried water, worked soil, tended animals, or repeated several kinds of labor over many years. Even a difference in dental disease may have more than one possible explanation. Men and women may have eaten somewhat different foods, eaten at different times, processed food differently, or passed through different biological demands. The condition of the mouth can also be shaped by age, local ingredients, food preparation, and the microscopic environment around the teeth. Archaeology therefore offers evidence of difference more readily than it offers certainty about cause. This uncertainty matters because the first farming villages stood near a deep turning point in the human story. For most of our species' existence, survival had depended on adjusting movement and food choices to changing landscapes. With cultivation, some of that flexibility remained, but daily life increasingly gathered around stored harvests, permanent buildings, nearby fields, and recurring work. The same settlement could contain people whose bodies encountered that new world from different positions. A child might begin helping with food preparation before reaching full growth. An adult might walk beyond the village with animals or remain close to houses and storage areas. A pregnant or nursing woman could face energy demands that no male body experienced, while a man might perform forms of travel or heavy work that were not shared equally by everyone. These are possibilities, not a universal map of prehistoric life. Customs differed, climates differed, and farming itself took many forms. What matters here is that biological sex, age, labor, diet, reproduction, disease, and social expectation could overlap within the same body. The skeleton preserved only the final result of that overlap. It did not separate one influence from another for later observers. This is why differences between male and female remains must be read slowly. They may point toward divided work, unequal access to food, different movement, or different exposure to illness. But they may also reflect several forces acting together. Beneath the first villages, the past did not leave us a clear account of what men did and what women did. It left patterns that suggest their bodies were sometimes being shaped along different paths, while keeping the reasons partly hidden. The central mystery becomes clearer when we imagine two people living within the same early village. They wake beneath roofs made from similar materials. They drink from the same nearby water source. They depend on grain harvested from the same fields and animals kept within the same landscape. Their children grow among the same houses, smoke, dust, insects, seasons, and stored food. From a distant view, their lives appear to belong to one shared system. Yet the bodies buried beneath that settlement may not preserve one shared physical history. Male and female skeletons can differ in the strength and shape of certain bones, in the condition of joints, in dental disease, in evidence of childhood stress, and in the injuries that healed before death. These differences do not appear everywhere, and even where they do appear, they do not always point in the same direction. One community may show strong contrasts in the upper limbs, while another may reveal more difference in mobility, diet, stature, or oral health. A third may show little separation at all. This uneven evidence prevents us from treating farming as a single force that acted on every human body in the same way. Farming was not only the planting of seeds, it was a new arrangement of time, movement, food, reproduction, storage, property, care, and obligation. The harvest may have been shared, but the work required to produce and prepare it may not have been divided equally. The same grain could pass through many hands before it became food. Someone cleared or opened the soil. Someone planted, guarded, gathered, carried, dried, stored, ground, mixed, cooked and distributed it. Some of these activities demanded long travel. Others demanded repeated movement in a small space. Some placed force on the legs and hips. Others placed force on the shoulders, arms, wrists, and back. The body responded not to the idea of farming, but to the precise pattern of effort repeated across years. Biological differences could also shape how those efforts were experienced. Pregnancy, birth, nursing, and recovery placed demands on female bodies that male bodies did not share. Yet biology alone cannot explain why a community organized food, movement, and labor in a particular way. Social customs may have guided who stayed near the settlement, who traveled farther, who received certain foods, who cared for children, and who performed tasks at different ages. Archaeology can sometimes detect the result of these arrangements, but it cannot fully reconstruct the rules behind them. The people themselves left no written explanation. Their bones preserve consequences without preserving instructions. This is why the earliest villages contain a quiet contradiction. Settlement brought people closer together, but it may also have organized their lives into more distinct physical routines. Stored food reduced some uncertainties, yet the labor of producing and processing that food introduced new forms of repetition and strain. A growing population could suggest success, while individual bodies still carried evidence of illness, nutritional difficulty, or heavy work. Men and women belonged to the same community, but belonging to the same community did not guarantee that they moved through it in the same way. The question is therefore not simply whether farming changed the human body. The deeper question is how one system of survival could pass through male and female bodies differently, leaving separate patterns inside people who lived only a few steps apart. Farming did not begin with a single decision made on a single morning. No community woke as hunters and gatherers and went to sleep as farmers. The change unfolded through countless small choices, repeated across generations, in landscapes where people already understood the habits of plants, animals, water, and weather. Long before full dependence on cultivated food, human groups gathered seeds, returned to productive places, protected useful plants, burned selected areas, stored food, and sometimes altered the movement of animals. These actions did not yet create farming in the later sense, but they slowly changed the relationship between people and the land. In some regions, wild cereals became more important. Elsewhere, roots, tubers, fruits, or managed animals played a larger role. Fishing and hunting often continued beside cultivation, sometimes for very long periods. The beginning of farming was therefore not a clean border between two ways of life. It was a broad zone of overlap where old practices and new routines existed together. This matters for the human body because physical change would also have been gradual. A person living in an early village might still travel far during one season, hunt when animals were available, gather wild foods, and return to planted fields at another time of year. Another person in the same settlement might spend more time processing grain, caring for stored food, tending children, carrying water, or maintaining houses. Their bodies were not suddenly transformed by the first seed placed in soil. They responded slowly to repeated patterns of movement, diet, disease, and work. The earliest farmers also did not share one environment. Some lived in dry valleys where water had to be carried or controlled. Others lived near rivers, forests, grasslands, or wetlands. The crops they used differed, the animals they kept differed, and the distances they traveled differed. Even neighboring communities could combine food sources in different proportions. For most of human existence, survival had depended on mobility and detailed knowledge of many resources. Early cultivation did not erase that older human inheritance. It added new obligations to it. Fields had to be revisited. Stored food had to be protected. Houses required repair. Harvests tied labor to particular seasons, yet uncertainty remained because rain, pests, soil, and illness could still destroy what people had planted. These pressures may have affected men and women differently, but the pattern could not have been identical everywhere because farming itself was not identical everywhere. A community that depended mainly on grain created different daily demands from one that mixed gardening, herding, fishing, and gathering. A settlement occupied throughout the year produced different conditions from one used only seasonally. The body followed these local rhythms. Children born during this transition may have grown under conditions unlike those experienced by their grandparents, even while both generations lived in what appeared to be the same cultural world. Changes in childhood diet, workload, exposure to infection, and the timing of daily responsibilities could accumulate quietly before any clear social boundary became visible. Bones, teeth, and growth recorded the cumulative result, but not the exact moment when the old way of life ended and the new one began. There may never have been such a moment. What later generations called agriculture emerged from a long human experiment with permanence, risk, labour, and food. Before farming could divide experience between male and female bodies, it first had to enter daily life slowly enough that no single generation could see the full transformation taking place. In many early farming communities, cultivated food did not replace the older ways of finding food. It was added to them. People planted grain or tended useful plants, yet they still gathered nuts, fruits, roots, and wild seeds when the season allowed. They kept animals, but they also hunted. They lived near fields, but rivers, lakes, coasts, forests, and grasslands remained part of the food system. Fish, shellfish, birds, and wild mammals could continue to matter for generations after crops appeared. This mixture was not a temporary mistake made by people who had not yet learned how to farm properly. It was often a practical response to uncertainty. A crop could fail, animals could become sick, rain could arrive too late or not at all. Wild resources offered another path when the harvest was poor, while stored grain offered support when hunting or gathering became difficult. The first communities to cultivate food were therefore not moving along one narrow road. They were balancing several forms of survival at the same time. That balance could shape male and female bodies differently, because each source of food required its own pattern of movement, skill, timing, and risk. Fishing might involve long hours near water, repeated pulling, carrying, or boat travel where boats were used. Herding could require walking beyond the settlement and responding to the seasonal needs of animals. Gathering might involve detailed knowledge of nearby plants, repeated bending, digging, cutting, and carrying. Grain required planting, guarding, harvesting, drying, storing, grinding, cooking, and protecting it from moisture and pests. These activities could be shared, divided by age, divided by sex, or reorganized whenever illness, pregnancy, death, weather, or family size changed the available labor. Archaeology rarely tells us exactly who performed each task. A fishing tool beside a burial does not prove that its owner used it every day. Animal bones near a house do not identify the hands that prepared the meat. Grinding stones show that plants were processed, but not that every community assigned that work to the same people. The body can preserve the effects of repeated labor, yet different activities may leave similar traces, and the same activity may affect two bodies differently. This is why mixed subsistence makes the central question more complex. A man and a woman living in the same village may not only have performed different tasks, they may have depended on different parts of the surrounding landscape. One body may have been shaped by long movement across open ground, another by repeated work close to the home, and another by a changing combination of both. These patterns were not fixed across the ancient world. In some places, women may have travelled widely, and men may have worked near houses. In others, labour may have been divided differently, or changed across the life course. The human beginning was built on flexibility, and early farming did not immediately remove that flexibility. It placed cultivation inside an older web of hunting, gathering, fishing, movement, memory, and seasonal return. Before agriculture became the dominant source of food in many regions, it was one element within a broader way of living. The bodies formed during this long overlap therefore cannot be understood as the bodies of complete farmers or complete foragers. They belong to people living between systems, where the same village could contain several paths through the land and several kinds of physical history. There was never one universal farming body, because there was never one universal form of farming. In one region, people depended heavily on wheat or barley. In another, millet, rice, maize, roots, or garden crops shaped the daily rhythm. Some communities lived with cattle, sheep, goats, or pigs. Others relied more strongly on fishing, wild plants, hunting, or combinations that changed with the season. Water could be close to the houses or several difficult journeys away. Fields could lie beside a settlement or across slopes that demanded long walking. Food might be prepared with grinding stones, pounding tools, ovens, boiling containers, or methods that left different demands on the hands, shoulders, spine, and teeth. These local conditions mattered more to the body than the broad label of farmer. A person cultivating a small wet garden did not move through the day in the same way as a person tending grain across dry ground. Someone following animals over open land experienced a different pattern of effort from someone repeatedly grinding stored seed near a house. Even when two settlements used similar crops, their bodies could develop differently because climate, tools, soil, settlement size, disease, and social customs changed the meaning of the work. This variation reaches back to the human beginning. Our species did not emerge with one fixed pattern of movement or one narrow source of food. Human survival depended on adjusting behavior to forests, coasts, plains, mountains, rivers, and changing seasons. Farming continued that long history of adaptation, but it also tied people more closely to particular places and recurring tasks. The result was not a clean replacement of flexible bodies by a standard agricultural form. It was a widening collection of local physical histories. The difference between male and female bodies must be understood within this diversity. A pattern found in one cemetery cannot safely become a rule for another continent or even for a neighbouring valley. In one community, women may have performed more repeated upper body work. In another, men and women may have shared many of the same activities. Elsewhere, age, household position, or season may have shaped labour more strongly than sex alone. Changes could also occur over time within the same settlement as new tools, animals, crops, or marriage customs altered daily routines. A burial ground may contain people born under different versions of the same farming system, each carrying the effects of a slightly different childhood and adult life. This is why scientists compare evidence cautiously. Bone shape, joint condition, dental disease, chemical traces in teeth and bone, tools, plant remains, animal remains, and settlement patterns can support one another, but none provides a complete account by itself. Together they reveal variation rather than a single model. The first farmers were not one population moving through one predictable transformation. They were many communities experimenting with ways to remain fed in particular landscapes. Their bodies responded to what they planted, what they still gathered, how far they walked, what they carried, what illnesses circulated, and how work was organized among people. Farming changed men and women differently only through these local arrangements. The same crop could support village life in two places while producing very different burdens of movement, food preparation, infection, and care. Before asking why male and female bodies separated into different patterns, we must first accept that the path into agriculture was never the same path for everyone. The human skeleton is not a fixed frame that remains unchanged from childhood to death. It is living tissue, continually maintained as the body grows, moves, heals, and ages. When muscles pull against bone and weight passes through the limbs, bone can respond gradually to those repeated demands. Its outer dimensions, internal structure, and distribution of tissue may change over time. This does not mean that every activity leaves a clear signature. Many forms of work produce similar forces, and the skeleton is also shaped by age, hormones, inherited traits, nutrition, illness, body size, and the conditions experienced during growth. Even so, bones may preserve broad patterns of physical use that become visible when many individuals are compared. The shafts of the arms and legs can provide clues about habitual loading. Differences between the right and left sides may suggest that one side was used more heavily, though they cannot identify the precise task. The shape of a joint may reflect years of movement, but joint damage can arise through several pathways and should not be treated as a direct record of occupation. Healed fractures show that injury occurred and that the person lived long enough for repair to begin, yet the cause may remain unknown. The skeleton remembers consequences more clearly than events. Teeth preserve another kind of history. Unlike bone, tooth enamel does not continually rebuild itself after it has formed. Disturbances during childhood growth can sometimes leave visible defects in enamel, creating a lasting indication that the developing body passed through a period of physiological difficulty. Such a mark does not name the cause. Infection, reduced nutrition, or several pressures acting together could have interrupted growth. The absence of a visible defect also does not prove that childhood was free from hardship. Dental decay, tooth loss, deposits around the teeth, and patterns of wear may help researchers consider food composition and preparation. Yet a damaged tooth cannot reveal an entire diet, and similar dental conditions may emerge from different combinations of food, age, biology, and oral environment. This careful distinction is essential when studying the beginning of farming. As people became more dependent on cultivated plants, permanent settlements, stored food, and recurring labor, the pressures entering the body changed. Bones and teeth could preserve parts of that transition, but they did not label those parts as farming, grinding, carrying, pregnancy, hunger, or disease. Researchers must bring together several forms of evidence before proposing an interpretation. Plant remains reveal what grew or was collected. Animal bones show which species entered the settlement. Tools suggest possible activities. Chemical evidence from human tissues may offer information about broad dietary patterns or movement between places. Burial context can show how the dead were treated, although it cannot provide a complete map of social life. The strongest understanding comes from agreement among several imperfect clues rather than from one dramatic sign. This is especially important when comparing male and female bodies. A difference in bone strength could reflect different work, different body size, different development, or a mixture of these influences. A difference in dental health might relate to food access, reproduction, age distribution, or local biology. The bones beneath early villages, therefore, do not give simple answers. They allow us to approach lives that were never written down, while reminding us that the beginning of agriculture reached each body through many overlapping forces. A skeleton does not preserve a job title. It cannot tell us that one person was a farmer, another a herder, and another someone who spent long hours preparing food. The body records repeated forces, injuries, disease, growth, and recovery, but these traces are indirect. Several kinds of work can place similar pressure on the same joint, and the same task can affect different people in different ways. A shoulder altered by years of movement may reflect lifting, carrying, grinding, throwing, climbing, or several activities combined. A worn knee may be connected to long walking, kneeling, age, injury, body weight, or conditions that began much earlier in life. Even when a pattern appears clearly, the path that created it often remains uncertain. This makes the study of early farming especially difficult because daily life involved many overlapping duties. A person could plant, harvest, carry water, care for animals, repair a house, prepare food, gather wild plants, and walk beyond the settlement during different seasons. The body would preserve the combined effect of these actions rather than keeping each one separate. Sex estimation from a skeleton also has limits. Researchers usually examine features of the pelvis and skull, together with measurements from other bones, but preservation may be incomplete and human variation does not fit perfectly into two simple groups. Biological sex, where it can be estimated with confidence, still does not reveal how a community understood gender or assigned work. A body identified as probably female does not prove that the person performed tasks later societies associated with women. A body identified as probably male does not prove that the person hunted, herded, fought, or travelled widely. Those assumptions can turn limited evidence into a story that the remains themselves never told. The beginning of agriculture must therefore be reconstructed from several kinds of evidence placed beside one another. Grinding stones may show that seeds or other plant foods were processed, but wear on a woman's arm does not by itself prove that she used them. Animal enclosures may suggest herding, but changes in male leg bones do not identify who followed the animals. Plant remains can reveal which crops were present, while chemical traces in teeth and bone may help researchers examine broad patterns of diet or movement. The location of houses, storage areas, hearths, paths, tools, and burials can add further context. None of these clues is complete, but together they can narrow the range of reasonable explanations. Age must also be considered. Older individuals have had more time to accumulate joint damage and dental disease. Childhood stress may influence adult growth and bone strength long before adult labor begins. Burial practices can distort the picture if only certain members of a community were placed in the cemetery that archaeologists later discovered. Poor preservation may remove fragile bones, and small samples can make chance differences appear meaningful. The past therefore reaches us through several filters before any comparison between men and women is made. This does not make the evidence useless. It makes careful interpretation more important. When multiple clues point in the same direction, researchers may reasonably suggest that daily movement, food access, or exposure to illness differed within a community, but the conclusion must remain close to the evidence. The skeleton can show that bodies follow different physical paths. It cannot on its own tell us who chose those paths, who controlled them, or what those differences meant to the people who lived at the human beginning of settled life. Biological sex and social gender are connected in many societies, but they are not the same kind of evidence. A skeleton may allow researchers to estimate whether a person was more likely male or female, especially when the pelvis is well preserved. Yet that estimate does not reveal how the community understood the person, what duties they performed, how they dressed, what authority they held, or how they moved through daily life. Those questions belong to the social world, and the social world is only partly visible in archaeology. Grave goods, burial position, house location, tools, ornaments, and patterns of movement can offer clues, but none provides a perfect translation of identity. A tool placed beside a body may have been used by that person, given as an offering, inherited, or included for reasons that are no longer recoverable. A richly furnished grave may suggest status, but status itself can be based on age, family, ritual role, wealth, or something else entirely. This distinction matters when asking why farming changed men's and women's bodies differently. It would be easy to assume that male bodies followed one set of tasks and female bodies another. In some communities, that may have been partly true. In others, the division may have been less clear, or organized more strongly by age, household, season, or local custom. A child might begin certain forms of work early. An older adult might shift toward tasks closer to the home. A pregnant or nursing woman could experience a different balance of labor and energy without necessarily having a completely different social role. A man might spend part of the year away with animals and another part repairing houses or helping with harvest. The skeleton records the combined physical result, but not the social rule that produced it. This is one reason researchers must be cautious with broad claims about prehistoric men and women. The long human beginning was marked by flexibility. Groups survived because they adjusted to climate, food, illness, population size, and the abilities of individual members. Farming did not immediately replace that flexibility with one rigid system. Over time, some communities may have developed stronger divisions in work and access to resources, while others remained more fluid. The evidence can show recurring differences between bodies, but it cannot always tell whether those differences came from choice, custom, necessity, inequality, or simple practical adaptation. What bones can tell us is more limited, and for that reason more reliable. They can show that bodies grew under particular conditions. They can preserve signs of repeated loading, disease, injury, repair, and nutritional difficulty. They can reveal that some groups within a settlement experience these conditions differently. What they cannot do is speak directly about motives, beliefs, emotions, or the full meaning of gender. The past does not become clearer when uncertainty is ignored. It becomes clearer when the limits of evidence are treated as part of the evidence itself. Beneath the first villages, male and female skeletons may carry different histories, but those histories remain layered. Biology, labor, food, reproduction, movement, age, and social life all entered the body together. The bones preserve the outcome, while the arrangement of life that created it must be reconstructed slowly, one cautious comparison at a time. Before farming became central to daily life, human movement was often shaped by changing landscapes. People followed animals, returned to seasonal plants, searched for water, gathered fuel, visited known shelters, and adjusted their routes as weather and resources changed. This did not mean that every group was constantly moving, or that all people traveled the same distances. Some communities remained near rich coasts, rivers, or wetlands for long periods. Even so, survival usually depended on a wide range of movements and on the ability to shift attention from one resource to another. With cultivation and more permanent settlement, part of that physical flexibility began to narrow, Work gathered around fields, houses, storage areas, animal enclosures, paths, and water sources. The body was still active, but activity increasingly returned to the same places and the same motions. Planting required bending, digging, pressing, or scattering. Harvesting required cutting, pulling, gathering, and carrying. Stored grain had to be cleaned, dried, protected, moved, and processed. Houses needed repair. Water and fuel had to be brought back repeatedly. Animals had to be fed, watched, moved, or restrained. None of these tasks was necessarily new in itself. What changed was their regularity and their connection to a fixed settlement. A movement repeated for a few days leaves a different history from the same movement repeated across seasons and years. The human body responds not only to how hard a task feels, but also to how often it is performed, how long it lasts, which direction force travels, and when in life the activity begins. A child who starts carrying, grinding, digging, or tending animals while still growing may develop under a different pattern of loading from an adult who begins the same work later. A person who walks far every day uses the body differently from someone who spends long hours in one area performing repeated upper body movements. Both may work intensely, yet the skeleton may preserve different results. This helps explain why settled life could begin separating male and female physical histories without requiring one group to work harder in every sense. The important difference may have been the kind of work, the part of the body most involved, the distance travelled, or the rhythm of repetition. In some communities, men may have moved farther through fields, pastures, forests, or exchange routes. In others, women may also have travelled widely. Work near the home could still be physically demanding, especially when it involved grinding food, carrying water, lifting containers, processing plants, maintaining fires, and caring for children at the same time. Archaeology cannot assign these tasks automatically, but it can show that settlement created conditions in which daily movement became more patterned. The long human beginning had favoured bodies capable of adjusting to varied demands. Farming did not remove that older capacity, but it placed more of life inside routines that returned each day. The path to food became shorter in some ways and more repetitive in others. Instead of searching across a changing landscape, people increasingly worked to make one place continue producing. That shift, repeated through generations, gave the body a new problem to solve, not only how to endure effort, but how to endure the same kinds of effort again and again. The work of farming did not enter the body as one single burden. It arrived through many separate tasks, each placing force on different muscles, joints, and bones. Digging soil required repeated pressure through the hands, arms, shoulders, back, and legs. Harvesting could involve bending, cutting, pulling, gathering, and carrying for long periods during a narrow season. Grain processing often demanded a different kind of effort. Seeds had to be cleaned, crushed, pounded, or ground before they became food, and these motions could be repeated for hours near the same place. Carrying water placed another pattern of stress on the body, especially when containers were heavy, and the path between source and settlement had to be walked many times. Caring for animals added still more variation. Some people may have followed herds across wider distances, while others fed, restrained, milked, cleaned, or watched animals close to the village. None of these activities belonged naturally to one sex in every community, but when labour became divided by custom, age, household, or circumstance, male and female bodies could begin to accumulate different physical histories. A person who spent years grinding grain might develop strong patterns in the upper limbs without travelling far. Another, giants that walked long distances behind animals, might place greater repeated load on the legs and hips. Someone who carried water while also caring for children could combine lifting, balancing, walking, and interrupted rest in ways that left no simple signature. The body does not classify work as important or unimportant. It responds only to force, repetition, recovery, nutrition, and time. This is why labour performed near the home should not be mistaken for light labour. Grinding, pounding, kneading, lifting vessels, feeding fires, processing plants, and moving stored food could demand endurance over many years. Field labour could be seasonal but intense. Herding could involve long movement without the same repeated upper body stress. Construction and repair could place large forces on the back and shoulders, but perhaps only during certain periods. The skeleton preserves the combined result of all these demands, and that result is shaped by when the work began. A growing child exposed to regular carrying or grinding may develop differently from an adult who takes on the same task later. Recovery also matters. The same workload can affect two people differently if one has better nutrition, more rest, fewer illnesses, or greater help from others. Pregnancy and nursing could further alter the balance between energy intake and physical demand for some women, while men in the same community might face different risks through travel, animal handling, land clearing, or conflict. These possibilities help explain why farming did not create one simple pattern of bodily change. It created a system in which daily survival was broken into many repeated actions. The first settled communities depended on all of them. A failed harvest could make every task more urgent, yet urgency did not erase division. It could deepen it. More grain might need to be processed, more water carried, more animals watched, and more wild food gathered to replace what the fields had not produced. During such periods, differences in responsibility could become differences in exhaustion, injury, and nutrition. Archaeology rarely captures a single difficult season, but repeated hardship across many years may contribute to broader patterns visible in a population. Food had to be produced, moved, transformed, protected, and shared. Each stage passed through human bodies before it reached the mouth. Over generations, the differences between those stages could become differences between skeletons, not because one group alone carried the burden of farming, but because the burden itself was divided into forms that the body remembered in different ways. Hard work alone does not explain how farming changed the body. Two tasks may feel equally exhausting and still leave very different physical effects because the body responds to the direction, frequency, duration, and timing of force. Carrying a heavy load for a short distance is not the same as grinding grain for several hours. Walking across uneven ground uses the hips, legs, feet, and spine in a different pattern from kneeling beside a stone and repeating the same movement through the shoulders and arms. Digging places force through tools into the hands, elbows, back, and lower body, while lifting water repeatedly may demand balance, grip, and steady control over many journeys. The skeleton does not measure effort in the way a person experiences fatigue. It adapts to mechanical patterns that return often enough and continue long enough to influence living tissue. Repetition is especially important. A motion that seems moderate on one occasion can become a major physical demand when performed every day across many years. The same is true of posture. Long periods of bending, kneeling, squatting, or holding the upper body in one position may shape joints and muscles differently from constant travel. Recovery changes the result as well. Work followed by adequate food, rest, and healing does not affect the body in the same way as work performed during illness, pregnancy, food shortage, or interrupted sleep. This helps explain why two people completing similar tasks may not leave similar skeletal traces. Their age, body size, childhood growth, health, and access to support all influence how the burden is absorbed. The age when labor begins may be even more important. A child's skeleton is still developing. Repeated movement during growth can influence bone form differently from the same movement begun in adulthood. In early farming communities, children may have joined household work gradually, carrying small loads, watching animals, collecting fuel, helping with food preparation, or learning seasonal tasks. Archaeology cannot usually identify the exact age when these responsibilities began, but the possibility matters because adult bodies preserve part of that earlier development. Differences between men and women may therefore have started before adulthood, through expectations that directed boys and girls toward different movements, foods, or levels of responsibility. Yet this cannot be assumed for every village. In some communities, children may have shared many tasks. In others, labor may have changed according to family need rather than sex. The human beginning was marked by flexibility, and even settled life required households to adjust when someone became injured, died, gave birth, or was absent. Farming created routines, but those routines were never perfectly fixed. This is why the physical effects of agriculture must be understood as accumulated patterns rather than simple reactions to heavy labor. Direction of force shaped which parts of the body worked most. Frequency determined how often tissues were challenged. Duration decided whether the challenge lasted minutes, seasons, or decades. Recovery influenced whether the body rebuilt or gradually struggled. Childhood established the foundation on which adult work acted. When these factors differed between male and female lives, their bodies could change along different paths even inside the same settlement. The difference did not require one group to be inactive and the other active. It could emerge from two equally demanding lives organized around different motions, different distances, and different opportunities to recover. Cultivated food allowed human communities to gather more energy from a smaller area of land, store part of the harvest, and support larger populations over time. This was one of the great practical advantages of farming. Grain could be dried, carried, counted, protected, and kept for seasons when fresh food was scarce. Roots, pulses, and other crops could also provide dependable calories when conditions were favorable. Yet a food system that supported more people did not always give every person a broader diet. In many early farming communities, daily meals became more dependent on a limited number of cultivated plants. The exact crops differed by region, and hunting, fishing, herding, and gathering often continued, but the balance gradually shifted. A larger share of energy could come from foods rich in starch, while the range of wild plants and animals entering the diet sometimes became narrower. This did not mean that all farmers were poorly nourished, or that all foragers had ideal diets. Food quality varied with climate, soil, wealth, season, storage, preparation, and access. Still, reliance on a small number of staples created a new kind of vulnerability. When one crop dominated the food supply, failure could affect the entire settlement. Even during successful years, enough calories did not always mean that every nutritional need was met equally. The body requires energy, but it also depends on protein, fats, minerals, and vitamins obtained through a varied diet. A bowl of grain can reduce hunger while leaving other needs less fully satisfied. The effects of this change could differ between men and women because their bodies did not always face the same demands or receive food in the same way. Pregnancy and nursing increased nutritional requirements for many women, while heavy labor increased energy needs for anyone performing it. If food was distributed unevenly by age, status, sex, or household position, two people eating from the same harvest could experience very different conditions. Even without deliberate inequality, daily routines could influence what each person consumed. Someone working near food preparation might eat differently from someone traveling with animals or laboring far from the settlement. Seasonal absence, fasting customs, illness, and the order in which family members were served may also have mattered in some societies, although such practices cannot usually be reconstructed with certainty. The beginning of agriculture, therefore, changed more than the amount of food available. It changed how food moved through the community. Grain passed from field to storage, from storage to grinding stone, from grinding stone to hearth, and from hearth to individual bodies. At every stage, labor and social organization shaped who handled it, who waited for it, and who received which portion. Children growing during periods of shortage could carry the effects into adulthood. Adults already weakened by infection or repeated pregnancy might have experienced the same diet differently from healthier members of the household. The human body does not respond only to what is eaten, but also to how often food arrives, how much variety it contains, and whether illness prevents nutrients from being absorbed. Farming made it possible to support more lives, but it also tied those lives more closely to a narrower chain of production. When that chain worked, villages could endure and expand. When it failed, the consequences reached every household. Yet even within one household, the same food system could leave different marks on male and female bodies because energy, labor, reproduction, illness, and access were never perfectly equal. The shift toward cultivated food changed the mouth because it changed not only what people ate, but also how food was prepared and how often certain carbohydrates reached the teeth. Many grains and starchy plants were ground, pounded, boiled, baked, or softened before eating. This made them easier to chew and allowed children, older adults, and people with weaker teeth to consume them more easily. Yet softer food did not necessarily protect the mouth. When starches are broken down during chewing, they can provide material for bacteria living in dental plaque. Those bacteria produce acids that gradually weaken the mineral surface of a tooth. If this process continues often enough, and if the tooth does not recover between meals, decay can begin. Early farming populations frequently show more dental caries than many earlier foraging groups, but this is a broad tendency rather than a universal rule. Some hunter-gatherers who relied heavily on starchy wild plants also developed substantial tooth decay, while some farming communities show lower levels than others. The important factor was not agriculture as a label. It was the particular combination of food, preparation, frequency of eating, oral bacteria, age, and local conditions. Grain could also be mixed with small particles from grinding stones, soil, ash, or processing surfaces. These particles sometimes increase tooth wear, although heavy wear and tooth decay do not always rise together. A tooth worn down quickly may lose the grooves where food collects, but severe wear can also expose deeper tissue and create other forms of damage. The mouth, therefore, carried several overlapping effects of the new food system. Softer meals reduced some chewing demands. Repeated starch exposure encouraged decay under certain conditions. Abrasive particles could wear the enamel. Infection around the gums could loosen teeth, while pain or tooth loss could make eating more difficult later in life. Men and women within the same settlement did not always show the same dental pattern. In some archaeological populations, women have been found with more caries or earlier tooth loss, but this difference cannot be treated as a universal feature of farming. Several explanations may contribute. Women and men may have eaten somewhat different foods or consumed them with different frequency. Work near food preparation could have influenced access to cooked grain, although proximity alone does not prove greater consumption. Pregnancy and hormonal changes can affect the environment of the mouth, while nausea, changes in eating behavior, and the nutritional demands of reproduction may also play a role in some individuals. Age is equally important because decay and tooth loss accumulate over time. If the women in a burial sample were older on average, the difference might partly reflect lifespan rather than diet. Cultural practices, childhood nutrition, saliva, illness, and the local oral microbiome could add further variation. This is why dental evidence must be interpreted beside the rest of the skeleton and the settlement. The first farming communities did not simply exchange healthy wild food for harmful grain. They entered a more complicated relationship with food. Cultivation increased reliability in some seasons and made storage possible, but it also brought repeated dependence on particular staples. Those staples passed through grinding, cooking, sharing, and daily routines before reaching the teeth. The mouth preserved the final interaction between biology and culture. When male and female teeth followed different paths, the difference may have reflected diet, reproduction, age, labor, or several forces acting together. Dental disease can reveal that bodies experience the same food system differently, but it cannot tell us a single reason why. Food does not pass from a field into every body, in equal amounts or under equal conditions. Between harvest and consumption, it moves through storage, preparation, household rules, seasonal shortages, and the needs of people whose bodies are not all asking for the same things. A man performing long hours of heavy labor may require more energy than someone engaged in lighter work. A pregnant or nursing woman may need additional nutrients while continuing to carry out demanding daily tasks. A child still growing depends on regular food for the development of bone, muscle, teeth, and organs. An older adult with damaged teeth or chronic illness may be unable to eat the same foods as younger members of the household. The same harvest can therefore create very different biological outcomes, even when everyone appears to share the same meals. In some early farming communities, food may have been divided according to age, sex, status, kinship, or household position. Archaeology cannot usually reconstruct the exact order in which people were served, and it cannot assume that all societies favored men or women in the same way. Yet small differences in access, repeated across years, could influence growth, recovery, fertility, resistance to disease, and the ability to endure physical labor. A person who regularly received less protein or fewer nutrient-rich foods might still survive on sufficient calories from grain, but the body could carry a quieter form of limitation. Another person might receive larger portions because their work was considered essential, while someone else might eat irregularly because caregiving or food preparation interrupted their own meals. These are reasonable possibilities, not universal rules. The evidence becomes more complex because biology and social organization interact. Pregnancy, birth, and nursing place demands on female bodies that male bodies did not experience, but the effect depended on diet, spacing between births, workload, disease, and the presence or absence of support. Men may have faced different pressures through travel, animal handling, land clearance, conflict, or seasonal work away from the settlement. If food availability was unstable, both could be affected, but not in identical ways. A short shortage during childhood might influence adult stature or enamel formation. Repeated shortages during adulthood might reduce the body's ability to recover from illness or labor. The beginning of agriculture tied these risks more closely to the success of a limited number of crops and to the social systems that controlled storage and distribution. Grain stored in one place could protect a village from immediate hunger, but storage also made food visible, measurable, and potentially unevenly controlled. This did not automatically create inequality, yet it created new possibilities for difference. Household size, inheritance, social rank, and access to animals or fertile land could all shape what reached the table. Over generations, these patterns might leave traces in bodies, but they would not appear as a simple line between healthy men and unhealthy women, or the reverse. Some communities may show stronger differences in male and female growth. Others may show more contrast in dental disease, injury, or nutritional stress. Still others may show little difference at all. The important point is that farming changed the route food took through society before it changed the body. The harvest was biological only after it had passed through human decisions, routines, and relationships. Men and women could depend on the same fields while receiving different mixtures of calories, nutrients, rest, and physical demand. Their bodies did not simply reflect what the land produced. They reflected how the community transformed that production into daily life. Women's labor in early farming communities was not necessarily lighter because it happened close to the home. Many of the tasks required to turn crops into food demanded strength, endurance, and repetition over long periods. Grain did not become edible when it was harvested. It had to be cleaned, dried, sorted, stored, crushed, ground, mixed, cooked, and protected from moisture, insects, and animals. Each stage required human effort. In many communities, women may have performed a large share of this work, although the exact division differed by place, period, age, and household need. Grinding grain by hand could involve repeated movement through the shoulders, arms, elbows, and wrists for hours at a time. Pounding seeds or roots required lifting and directing force again and again. Kneading, stirring, carrying vessels, tending fires, and preparing meals added further demands. None of these motions appears dramatic when seen once. Their importance comes from repetition. A movement performed every day, across years, can shape the body more deeply than a heavier task performed only occasionally. This is why some female skeletons from early farming populations show evidence of strong upper body loading. Such patterns do not prove that every woman ground grain, and they do not reveal one exact occupation. They suggest that repeated manual labor may have been a major part of life for many women in certain communities. The long human beginning had required both men and women to gather, carry, process, and share food. Farming did not invent women's labor. It changed its rhythm. Work that had once followed changing plants and seasons could become concentrated around fixed tools, storage spaces, hearths, and daily household needs. The same stone might be used again and again. The same containers had to be filled, emptied, cleaned, and moved. The same fire required fuel. The same field produced food that still demanded many hours of preparation before anyone could eat it. Women's work may also have combined several demands at once. Food processing could occur while watching children, nursing an infant, maintaining a fire, or responding to other household duties. Carrying a child while moving water, fuel, or food created a different physical burden from carrying one object alone. Interrupted rest and the energy demands of pregnancy or nursing could reduce recovery, even when the visible workload remained unchanged. Yet it would be misleading to imagine one universal female routine. Some women may have worked in fields, travelled with animals, collected wild foods, fished, built houses, or taken part in exchange. Others may have spent more time near the settlement. Age, health, Family size, season, and local custom all mattered. Archaeology can identify broad differences in bone use, but it cannot assume that every difference followed the same social rule. What it can show is that work near the household was capable of producing strong and lasting effects on the body. The first villages depended not only on planting and harvesting, but on the repeated transformation of raw materials into food, clothing, shelter, and care. These tasks rarely left large monuments behind. They left worn stones, broken tools, traces around hearths, and sometimes patterns within bone. The physical history of farming, therefore, cannot be understood only by looking toward fields or herds. It must also look toward the quieter spaces where food was processed and daily life was maintained. In those spaces, women's bodies may have absorbed some of the most constant demands of the agricultural world: water, fuel, food, building material, and children all had to be moved through the settlement, and much of this work may have fallen repeatedly on women in some farming communities. The exact pattern differed from place to place, but carrying was one of the quiet foundations of settled life. A village could not survive only through planting. Water had to reach the hearth. Firewood had to be gathered and brought home. Grain had to be moved from field to storage, and from storage to the place where it was prepared. Clay, reeds, timber, hides, baskets, and stones had to be carried for building and repair. Infants and young children also had to be transported while adults continued working. These tasks placed demands on the shoulders, arms, back, hips, and legs, often in combination rather than separately. A container of water may not seem extraordinary when lifted once. Carried daily over the same path, however, it becomes part of the body's long history. The distance to the water source, the weight of the vessel, the slope of the ground, and the method of carrying all changed how force entered the skeleton. Loads balanced on the head affected the body differently from loads held in the arms, placed on the back, or suspended from one side. Carrying a child added movement that could not always be controlled. The body had to adjust to shifting weight while walking, bending, or performing another task. In some communities, women may have combined childcare with gathering fuel, preparing food, or moving materials around the settlement. This did not mean that men never carried water or children, or that women were always responsible for these tasks. Archaeology cannot recover such a universal rule. What it can show is that repeated carrying, especially when combined with upper body work, may help explain why some female skeletons developed strong patterns of loading. The beginning of farming increased the number of materials that had to circulate through one fixed place. A mobile group also carried possessions, food, and children, but permanent settlement created a different rhythm. Houses remained, so walls and roofs required repair. Fields returned each year, so seed, tools, and harvests moved along familiar routes. Storage allowed more food to accumulate, yet accumulation itself created work. Grain in a storehouse had to be lifted, measured, protected, and redistributed. Animals kept near the village needed water, fodder, fencing, and cleaning. The labour of permanence was often the labour of moving heavy things over short distances again and again. Recovery could be limited when these tasks overlapped with pregnancy, nursing, illness, or poor nutrition. A woman might continue carrying water while her body was supporting fetal growth or producing milk. Another might care for several children while preparing food for a larger household. These pressures did not produce the same result in every body, because age, health, support, and workload differed. Some women may have shared tasks widely with relatives. Others may have faced concentrated responsibility. The human body records the total pattern, not the social arrangement behind it. This is why strong upper body development in women should not be reduced to one activity such as grain grinding. It may reflect a broader world of carrying, lifting, balancing, feeding, building, and care. Much of this labour left few visible monuments. Water containers broke. Baskets decayed. First, 1. 3. Wood disappeared. Children grew. Yet the repeated effort required to sustain village life may have remained within the bones of the women who performed it. Evidence from one region can illuminate a part of the past without becoming a description of every prehistoric woman. Studies of female skeletons from farming communities in Central Europe have found patterns consistent with substantial and repeated loading of the upper limbs. Comparisons with living women have helped researchers understand how unusual some of these patterns may have been. The finding is important because it challenges the old habit of imagining agricultural work mainly through male bodies while treating women's work as physically minor. Yet its meaning must remain carefully bounded. These skeletons came from particular populations, landscapes, periods, and burial samples. They do not represent all women who lived after farming began, and they do not prove that one task, such as grinding grain, created every observed change. Bone responds to a lifetime of activity, growth, nutrition, health, body size, and recovery. A strong upper arm can reflect many repeated actions performed together, rather than one occupation preserved in bone. Women in another region may have used different crops, tools, carrying methods, and food processing techniques. Their water source may have been closer, their fields farther away, or their animals more important to daily survival. Some may have moved across wide territories. Others may have worked mainly within a dense settlement. In coastal communities, fishing and gathering shellfish could remain central. In forested regions, fuel collection and the processing of wild plants might add different demands. Where roots or tubers mattered more than grain, food preparation would not necessarily resemble the motions found in cereal-based farming. The beginning of agriculture, therefore, produced many female physical histories, rather than one agricultural female body. Social arrangements also changed through time. Work could be shared among relatives, divided by age, exchanged between households, or reorganized when pregnancy, injury, illness, death, or seasonal pressure reduced the number of available workers. A woman might perform demanding upper body labor during one period of life and shift toward other activities later. Another might begin carrying and processing food while still young. A third might have greater support and more time to recover. Even within the same cemetery, women were not exposed to identical lives. Differences in age and preservation can further shape what researchers see. The people whose remains survived may not represent everyone who lived in the settlement. Some burial places are never found, and some bodies preserved more completely than others. This is why careful archaeology does not move from a striking result to a universal claim. It asks whether the pattern appears in other communities, whether it changes through time, and whether tools, settlement design, diet, and other evidence support the interpretation. The wider lesson is not that all prehistoric women possess the same extraordinary strength, nor should modern athletic comparisons be read as direct measurements of ancient muscle, or as proof that every individual performed harder work than people today. Such comparisons help place skeletal loading within a familiar range, but ancient bodies and modern bodies developed under very different diets, illnesses, technologies, and patterns of activity. It is more accurate to say that farming depended on forms of female labor that earlier accounts often failed to recognize. Much of that work occurred without monuments, written records, or objects designed to endure. Its traces may survive only as worn tools, altered spaces, and changes within the skeleton. These quiet remains restore women to the physical history of agriculture, while also reminding us not to replace one oversimplified picture with another. Women were central to farming communities, but they were never one uniform group. Their bodies changed according to local work, food, reproduction, movement, health, and support. Just as the many beginnings of farming changed human life in different ways, men's bodies in early farming communities may have followed different paths through the landscape, but those paths were never identical across every region. In some places, men may have spent more time moving between fields, pastures, forests, hunting grounds, or neighboring settlements. Herding could require long periods of walking, especially where animals had to be taken to seasonal grazing areas or distant water. Land clearing could demand repeated cutting, lifting, dragging, and burning. Hunting did not disappear when cultivation began, and in some communities it remained an important source of food, materials, and skill. Exchange between settlements may also have taken certain people beyond the village, carrying tools, stone, salt, animals, or other goods across familiar routes. These activities could place more regular strain on the legs, hips, spine, and feet than work performed mainly near houses and storage areas. Yet movement alone did not define male labor, and not every man traveled widely. Some men may have spent much of their time building, repairing, processing food, caring for animals near the settlement, or working in fields close to home. Others may have moved only during particular seasons. The physical history of the body depended on how often these activities occurred, how far they extended, and whether they began early in life. This makes the decline of mobility after the adoption of farming more complicated than it first appears. In several archaeological populations, changes in the shape and strength of leg bones suggest that average long-distance movement became less common over time. Settlement reduced the need for some forms of travel because food, shelter, tools, and social life became concentrated in one place. But less distance did not mean less effort. A man who no longer followed wild herds across a wide territory might still spend long days digging, cutting wood, moving soil, tending livestock, or repairing walls. The body could become less adapted to constant travel while remaining heavily loaded in other ways. This distinction matters when male and female skeletons are compared. A stronger pattern in male lower limbs may suggest greater mobility in one community, while another population may show only small differences. In some places, women may also have walked long distances for water, gathering, trade, or herding. Labor divisions could shift when households lost members, when seasons changed, or when new crops and animals altered the daily routine. The first farming villages were not organized by one universal rule. They were practical systems that had to respond to local needs. Men's movement may also have carried different risks. Travel exposed the body to falls, animal injuries, conflict, weather, and time away from stored food or household care. Land clearing and construction could create trauma through tools, falling wood, or heavy loads. Yet an injury in a male skeleton does not prove warfare or a dangerous occupation. It only shows that trauma occurred and that the person survived long enough for healing when healing is visible. The long human beginning had shaped bodies through mobility, but farming slowly changed the scale and purpose of that movement. Men may still have crossed open ground, followed animals, or worked beyond the village, yet their roots increasingly served fields, herds, property, and exchange. The body was no longer moving only to find food. It was moving to maintain a system of production tied to one settlement. Over generations, this shift could create male physical patterns that differed from those of women living nearby, not because one group alone worked hard, but because their effort traveled through different spaces. As farming became more established, the distance traveled by many people appears to have declined in some regions, but the meaning of that decline must be understood carefully. A body that moves across a smaller territory is not necessarily a body that works less. Long-distance mobility and daily physical effort are different things. A man who once followed animals or seasonal resources across a wide landscape might later spend more time near fields, fences, houses, and storage areas. The radius of movement could shrink while the intensity of labor remained high. Digging, cutting wood, repairing buildings, moving soil, tending animals, and carrying harvests could demand strength for many hours without taking a person far from the settlement. The legs might experience less repeated travel over long distances, while the back, shoulders, arms, and joints continued to absorb heavy work. This helps explain why skeletal evidence for reduced mobility should not be interpreted as evidence of comfort. Farming changed the pattern of effort more than it removed effort. In some archaeological populations, the shape and internal strength of leg bones suggest that habitual movement over large areas became less common after settled food production expanded. Yet this change did not occur everywhere at the same speed. People living with mobile herds, distant fields, seasonal pastures, or scattered resources could continue walking far. Others remained close to rivers, fertile land, and compact villages. Men in one community may have spent much of the year beyond the settlement, while men elsewhere worked mostly within sight of home. The crops, animals, terrain, and tools all shaped the distance a body travelled. Age and social position also mattered. Younger men might take on more distant work, while older men shifted toward tasks requiring less travel. A household could many workers could divide responsibilities differently from one weakened by illness or death. The long human beginning had produced bodies capable of endurance across varied landscapes, but settlement gradually redirected that endurance. Movement became tied to property, crop cycles, herd management, boundaries, and repeated routes. A path to a field might be walked every day, but it was not the same as moving through a broad territory in response to many changing resources. Repeated short journeys can still be exhausting, yet they load the body differently from sustained travel across uneven ground. This difference may have contributed to contrasts between male and female skeletons where their routines were divided. Men who spent more time walking between fields, grazing areas, forests, or neighbouring settlements could preserve different lower body patterns from women whose work placed greater repeated demand on the upper limbs. But such a division was never universal. Women also carried water, gathered plants, visited fields, moved between households and sometimes tended animals. Men also processed food, built fires, cared for children and performed work near the home. The evidence points to tendencies within particular communities, not permanent natural roles. Reduced mobility also changed exposure to risk. Staying nearer the village may have lowered some dangers associated with long travel, yet it increased dependence on local harvests, nearby water, and crowded settlement conditions. A person could walk less and still face injury, infection, poor nutrition, or overwork. The physical effects of farming, therefore, cannot be described as a simple movement from hardship to ease. For many men, the body may have lost some of the wide-ranging movement of earlier life, while becoming more deeply tied to repetitive labour in a smaller space. The distance narrowed, but the burden did not necessarily become lighter. The later development of plowing, animal traction, stronger claims over land, and organised conflict added new layers to the physical history of farming men. These changes did not arrive with the first planted fields, and they did not appear everywhere at the same time. Early cultivation was often performed with digging sticks, hoes, and other hand tools. In some regions, cattle were later used to pull ploughs, carts, or heavy loads. Animal power could expand the amount of land worked by a household and change the speed at which soil, harvests, and materials were moved. Yet animals did not remove human labour. They created new work around training, guiding, feeding, watering, breeding, and controlling large bodies that could injure the people beside them. If men carried out more of this work in some communities, their bodies may have encountered a mixture of walking, forceful tool use, heavy lifting, and sudden risk. That pattern cannot be assumed for all societies, but it may help explain why male activity changed as agriculture became more complex. The growing importance of land could also alter movement. Fields improved over years through clearing, manuring, irrigation, or repeated cultivation became valuable places that families might try to protect and pass to later generations. A man's daily path might become tied more closely to boundaries, animals, storage facilities, and fields claimed by a household or wider kin group. This was different from the long human beginning, when access to food often depended on flexible movement through broad landscapes rather than permanent control of one prepared area. Farming did not immediately create private ownership in the modern sense, and communities organized land in many ways. Some resources may have been shared, while others were controlled by households, lineages, villages, or local authorities. Still, the possibility of accumulating crops, animals, and improved land gave people more things that could be guarded, inherited, exchanged, or contested. Conflict was not an automatic result. Many agricultural communities lived without evidence of frequent violence, and cooperation was essential for planting, water management, building, and survival. Yet, archaeological discoveries from some places show that early farmers could experience raids, attacks, and lethal violence. Men often appear more frequently among individuals with certain traumatic injuries in a number of populations, though the pattern varies and does not prove that all men were fighters or that women were absent from conflict. An injured skull cannot reveal whether violence arose from land, animals, food shortage, personal dispute, or a cause now lost. It shows an event, not its full meaning. Ploughing and animal traction could therefore redirect male labour toward new forms of production, while land claims and conflict added risks that were social as well as physical. These changes may have strengthened differences between male and female bodies in some later farming societies, especially where men travelled with livestock, handled large animals, cleared land, guarded resources, or joined confrontations beyond the household. Elsewhere, women may have participated in many of these activities, or the division may have followed wealth and age more strongly than sex. The agricultural body never stopped changing after farming began. New tools altered movement. New animals altered power. Stored wealth altered relationships. Boundaries altered the meaning of distance. Men's skeletons could carry the results through patterns of loading, injury, mobility, and recovery, but no bone can tell us that these developments formed one unavoidable male role. They show only that as farming systems expanded, the paths available to men could become more closely tied to land, animals, property, and the uncertain dangers created around them. When people began living more permanently in farming settlements, reproduction became part of a new biological and social environment. Pregnancy had always demanded energy, nutrients, protection, and time. Birth had always carried risk, and nursing had always required the mother's body to continue supporting a child after delivery. Farming did not create these demands, but it may have changed how often some women experienced them and how easily the body could recover between one birth and the next. In mobile communities, carrying an infant over long distances could place practical limits on how many very young children a mother cared for at the same time. Breastfeeding often continued for long periods, and frequent nursing can delay the return of ovulation in many women, although the effect varies greatly between individuals and populations. More settled life could alter this balance. Stored foods made it possible in some communities to introduce soft grain preparations or other weaning foods earlier, reducing an infant's complete dependence on breast milk. Permanent houses also allowed food, vessels, bedding, and caregiving to remain in one place. Mothers no longer had to move every possession and every child whenever the group changed camp. These conditions may have contributed to shorter intervals between births in some early farming populations, but the process was neither automatic nor universal. Diet, health, cultural practices, breastfeeding patterns, workload, and infant survival all affected reproductive timing. Archaeological population patterns suggest that many regions experienced increased birth rates after farming expanded, yet those patterns do not reveal the experience of every woman. A growing village could contain more surviving children while individual mothers faced repeated pregnancy, nursing, physical labor, and limited recovery. Population growth, therefore, should not be confused with improved health. A community may become larger because more children are born, even when disease, nutritional stress, and mortality also remain high. For women, settled life could bring support as well as pressure. Relatives living nearby might help with childcare, food preparation, or household work. Older children could contribute to daily tasks. Stored food could provide protection against short periods when gathering or hunting failed. At the same time, larger households required more water, fuel, food processing, cleaning, and care. A woman might return to demanding work soon after birth because the household could not function without her labor. Pregnancy could continue alongside grinding grain, tending crops, carrying water, caring for older children, and maintaining fires. The body had to divide available energy between its own maintenance, physical work, fetal growth, and milk production. When food was varied and support was strong, these demands might be managed more successfully. During infection, crop failure, or shortage, the same demands could become much harder to meet. This created a physical history that male bodies did not share directly. Men could experience hunger, disease, exhaustion, and heavy labor, but they did not undergo pregnancy, birth, or lactation. The difference did not mean that every woman was weaker or less healthy. It meant that farming entered female biology through an additional pathway. The long human beginning had always joined reproduction to survival, but settled food production may have brought births, work, and caregiving into a tighter cycle. As villages expanded, the success of the population could rest partly on women repeatedly carrying biological demands that remained largely invisible in the houses, fields, and storage pits left behind. Pregnancy, nursing, physical labor, illness, and recovery all draw from the same limited supply of energy. The body does not maintain a separate reserve for each demand. It must continually divide available nutrients and effort between survival, movement, repair, fetal growth, and milk production. In early farming communities, this balance could become especially difficult because women often remained active through every stage of reproduction. A pregnant woman might still carry water, gather fuel, process grain, tend crops, care for children, and maintain the household. After birth, nursing added another continuous demand while daily work resumed. The amount of support available from relatives, older children, or other household members could greatly change the burden, but that support is rarely visible in archaeological remains. Two women living in the same settlement may therefore have experienced reproduction very differently. One may have had enough food, rest, and assistance to recover well. Another may have passed through repeated pregnancies while facing infection, shortage, heavy labor, or the recent loss of family members who had once shared the work. The long human beginning had always required mothers to balance reproduction with movement and survival, but settled farming added new forms of regular labor that could not easily be delayed. Grain still had to be ground, water still had to be carried, animals still had to be fed, fires still had to be maintained. The household's need for food did not pause because one body was healing. This created a form of pressure that was biological and social at the same time. A woman's body responded to pregnancy and nursing, while the village continued to demand work according to crop cycles, seasons, and household size. Poor nutrition could intensify the strain, but enough calories alone did not guarantee full recovery. A diet dominated by a few staple foods might satisfy hunger while providing less variety than the body needed. Infection could reduce appetite or interfere with the use of nutrients. Dental pain could make eating difficult. Repeated childbirth with limited recovery might further narrow the body's ability to rebuild, especially when labor remained constant. None of these pressures affected every woman equally, and archaeology cannot identify a precise reproductive history from the skeleton alone. Some changes in bone and teeth may be influenced by pregnancy or nursing, but they can also result from age, diet, disease, workload, or several factors acting together. Researchers must therefore avoid treating one skeletal sign as proof of repeated childbirth or nutritional depletion. The most reliable picture comes from population patterns considered beside evidence of diet, health, settlement size, and burial age. Even then, conclusions must remain cautious. What can be said with confidence is that reproduction created an additional pathway through which farming could affect female bodies differently from male bodies. Men also faced food shortage, infection, injury, and exhausting work, yet they did not have to support fetal growth or produce milk while meeting those same demands. This difference could become more important in communities where birth intervals shortened, population grew, and household labor remained intense. A larger village might appear successful from the outside, with more houses, more children, and more stored grain. Inside that success, however, some women may have carried repeated cycles of work, pregnancy, nursing, and incomplete recovery. The growth of the settlement was therefore not separate from the strain placed on individual bodies. It was partly built through them. A growing population can look like evidence that farming improved human life, but population growth and individual well-being are not the same thing. A village may become larger because more children are born, because food can be stored, or because families remain in one place for longer periods. None of this proves that every woman experienced better health, greater safety, or easier recovery. In some early farming populations, increased fertility may have occurred alongside heavier workloads, more frequent infection, reduced dietary variety, and shorter intervals between births. The community could expand even while individual bodies carried greater strain. This is one of the central paradoxes of settled life. Success at the level of population may conceal difficulty at the level of the person. A woman could give birth several times, nurse young children, prepare food, carry water, and continue daily labor while her own body had limited time to recover. If many women survived long enough to repeat this cycle, the settlement might grow. Yet survival alone does not reveal the pain, exhaustion, nutritional pressure, or illness that may have accompanied those years. Archaeology rarely preserves such experiences directly. It sees patterns in age at death, childhood stress, dental disease, skeletal growth, burial numbers, and settlement expansion. These clues can suggest that demographic change occurred, but they cannot reconstruct each pregnancy or every period of recovery. This is why population growth must be interpreted with care. A larger number of births may reflect more stable access to stored calories, earlier weaning in some communities, or the practical advantages of permanent settlement. At the same time, crowded living could increase exposure to disease. Greater dependence on staple crops could narrow the diet. Repeated reproduction could place additional demands on women already performing heavy work. The long human beginning had always tied reproduction to environmental conditions, but farming created a more concentrated system. Food, children, work, animals, waste, and disease gathered within the same settlement. The biological success of the group became more closely connected to the ability of women to move through repeated cycles of pregnancy, nursing, labor, and care. Yet women were not passive instruments of population growth. They were active members of households and communities, and their experiences varied according to support, age, status, health, kinship, and local custom. Some may have received help from relatives and older children. Others may have carried a much greater share of the burden. Some communities may have protected mothers during pregnancy or after birth. Others may have expected work to continue with little interruption. The evidence does not allow one universal picture. What it does allow is a more cautious conclusion. The spread of farming may have increased the number of people a landscape could support, without improving every measure of health for the people living there. For women, this difference could be especially important because reproduction created demands that male bodies did not face directly. Men and women could share the same harvest, disease environment, and physical labor, yet women also had to absorb the costs of fetal growth, birth, and milk production. This did not guarantee poorer health in every case, but it created another route through which the agricultural system could affect the sexes differently. The growth of early villages should therefore be understood not only as an increase in houses or graves, but as the result of many individual bodies enduring repeated demands. A settlement could flourish while some of those bodies were pushed close to their limits. The history of farming is not only the history of how many people survived, it is also the history of what survival required from them. Permanent settlement changed the environment of disease because people, animals, food, water, and waste began remaining close together for longer periods. A mobile group could leave behind a contaminated camp, move away from exhausted resources, and reduce repeated contact with the same ground. A farming village could not do this so easily. Houses, storage pits, fields, animal enclosures, paths, wells, and burial places tied the community to one location. The advantages were clear. Food could be stored, shelters improved, and social networks maintained across seasons. Yet permanence also allowed waste to accumulate. Human refuse, animal dung, spoiled food, insects, standing water, and smoke became recurring parts of the settlement. Rain could wash contamination toward living areas or water sources. Dry weather could fill houses with dust carrying material from floors, animals, and waste. These conditions did not create every disease associated with later cities, and small early villages were not simply miniature urban slums. Population size, climate, sanitation, settlement design, and local ecology all mattered. Still, living repeatedly on the same ground increased opportunities for parasites and infections to circulate. The first farming communities also changed their relationship with water. A dependable source was essential for drinking, cooking, cleaning, crops, and animals, but the more people and livestock used the same area, the easier it became for that source to be contaminated. Carrying water into the settlement did not guarantee safety. Containers, hands, food preparation surfaces, and storage practices could all influence what entered the body. Children were especially vulnerable to diarrheal illness and dehydration, while adults weakened by poor nutrition, pregnancy, injury, or heavy labor might recover more slowly. Disease therefore became part of the same system that produced food. The field supported the village, but the village created conditions in which infection could move between households. This change reached back to the human beginning because our species had evolved within small, flexible communities exposed to many hazards, but not always to the same concentration of waste and repeated contact. Farming did not introduce illness into human life. It reorganized exposure. Some infections became easier to maintain when enough people lived near one another. Other diseases spread through contaminated soil, food, water, insects, or close contact, rather than requiring a very large population. The daily tasks of men and women could create different levels of exposure. Someone caring for young children might encounter bodily waste and infection more often. A person carrying water could have repeated contact with contaminated sources. Those tending animals might face dung, parasites, bites, and injuries. Field workers could be exposed to standing water, soil organisms, heat or cold. Food processors handled grain that could mold, attract rodents, or become contaminated during storage. These divisions were not universal, but where labor followed different paths, disease could follow those paths as well. The body recorded only the result: slowed growth, inflammation, lesions, tooth loss, weakness, or death. Many infections leave no clear mark on bone, so skeletal evidence captures only a small fraction of the illnesses people endured. A village could contain widespread sickness without preserving an obvious signature in every grave. This is why the disease environment of early farming must be reconstructed from settlement conditions, parasite evidence, human remains, animal remains, and patterns of growth together. The new danger was not one single pathogen, it was the concentration of daily life. People had gained a more stable place to live, but that stability also meant remaining close to the same water, the same animals, the same waste, and the same sources of infection through season after season. Living near domesticated animals changed human exposure to infection, but the relationship was more complicated than the simple idea that animals suddenly gave people new diseases. Humans had always encountered wild animals, parasites, contaminated meat, insects, and injured skin. Farming increased the frequency, duration, and intimacy of some of those contacts. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, dogs, and other animals could remain close to houses, storage areas, paths, and water sources. Their dung accumulated where people walked and worked. Their feed attracted rodents and insects. Their bodies carried parasites, while bites, scratches, and handling injuries created openings through which infection could enter. The risk depended on the animal, the climate, the size of the settlement, and the way people organized space. A village that kept livestock beyond its houses did not create the same environment as one where animals regularly entered living areas. Some communities moved herds seasonally, while others kept animals nearby throughout much of the year. These differences mattered because disease does not respond to the broad label of farming. It responds to contact, density, sanitation, immunity, and opportunity. Many infections that later became important in dense cities could not circulate continuously in small early villages. Others, especially parasites and illnesses spread through soil, water, food, or close contact, did not require enormous populations. Remaining in one place made repeated exposure possible. Eggs or larvae from parasites could persist in contaminated ground. Waste could enter streams or shallow wells. Stored grain could attract rodents, whose droppings and fleas added further hazards. Smoke from indoor fires and dust from animal enclosures could irritate the lungs, making breathing more difficult even when no specific disease can now be identified. These conditions affected men and women through the work they performed. Someone who cleaned animal areas, milked, fed, or restrained livestock encountered one set of risks. Someone who followed herds across open land faced another, including weather, injury, and contact with animals away from the settlement. Women caring for children or preparing food might experience repeated exposure to household contamination, while men working with large animals might face more traumatic injuries in some communities. Yet these divisions varied widely. Women also herded and handled animals, and men also worked near houses, water, and stored food. The long human beginning had prepared people to respond to many infections, but biological defenses are never complete. Nutrition, age, pregnancy, exhaustion, and previous illness all influenced whether exposure led to recovery or serious disease. A well-fed adult could withstand an infection that threatened a young child or a person weakened by repeated labor and poor diet. Pregnancy and nursing could increase the consequences of illness for some women, while travel and animal handling could expose some men to risks less common within the household. The body therefore met infection through both biology and daily routine. Archaeology rarely identifies this process clearly because most illnesses leave no permanent change in bone. A person may suffer fever, diarrhea, respiratory disease, or parasitic infection and leave no recognizable skeletal trace. Evidence from ancient waste, soil, teeth, animal remains, and microscopic analysis can sometimes reveal parts of the disease environment, but the record remains incomplete. What survives suggests not that farming introduced one sudden wave of animal disease, but that permanent settlement created longer and more repeated pathways between human bodies, animal bodies, food, water, insects, and contaminated ground. Men and women could live within the same village while moving through different parts of that network. Their bodies encountered the same settlement, but not always the same exposure. Disease did not move through an early farming village in the same way for every person. Exposure depended on age, work, movement, pregnancy, caregiving, household position, and the spaces each person entered most often. Young children were especially vulnerable because their immune systems were still developing. Their bodies lost water quickly during illness, and they spent much of their time close to floors, dust, animals, food remains, and other children. Adults who cared for them could also experience repeated contact with bodily waste, respiratory infection, and contaminated surfaces. In many communities, this work may have involved women more often, but the pattern cannot be treated as universal. Grandparents, older siblings, fathers, and other relatives may also have shared care. What mattered biologically was not the title of the caregiver, but the frequency and closeness of contact. Pregnancy could create another difference. A pregnant woman did not necessarily become ill more often, but infection, poor nutrition, and physical exhaustion could have greater consequences when the body was already supporting fetal growth. Nursing added further energy demands after birth. A disease that might be manageable for one adult could become more difficult for another whose body had less time to rest or recover. Men could face different risks when work took them farther from the settlement. Herding, hunting, land clearing, irrigation, construction, and travel exposed the body to weather, wounds, animals, insects, and unfamiliar water sources. A cut received while clearing land could become infected. Long periods away from stored food might weaken recovery. Contact with livestock could increase the chance of bites, kicks, parasites, or contamination. Yet men were not protected from household disease, and women were not confined to domestic spaces. Both could work in fields, handle animals, carry water, or travel. The difference came from how often particular risks were repeated. Household position also mattered. A person with access to better food, warmer shelter, cleaner water, or help during illness had a greater chance of recovery than someone with fewer resources. In a crowded house, one infection could spread rapidly among several generations. In another household, more space or stronger social support might reduce the burden. Farming made these differences more visible because food, property, labor, and care were increasingly organized around households that could vary in size and wealth. The long human beginning had always placed people within networks of dependence, but settled life concentrated those networks inside permanent spaces. Disease followed the same paths as food and labor. Water carriers encountered the water source. Food processors encountered stored grain, dust, mold, and rodents. Animal keepers encountered dung and parasites. Caregivers encountered sick children and weakened adults. Field workers encountered soil, insects, standing water, heat, and cold. These exposures did not guarantee illness, but they shaped the opportunities through which illness entered the body. Archaeology can rarely reconstruct every pathway. Many infections leave no trace in bone, and skeletal differences may reflect several causes at once. Slowed growth could result from repeated illness, poor diet, or both. Weakness could increase the risk of injury, while injury could reduce the ability to work and obtain food. Men and women, therefore, did not experience one simple disease environment. They lived inside overlapping networks of exposure, protection, labor, and recovery. The same village surrounded everyone, but each body moved through a different map of risk. Stored food, cultivated land, animals, and permanent houses changed more than the practical work of survival. They created forms of value that could remain in one place and pass from one generation to the next. A successful harvest could be stored. A cleared field could become more productive through repeated use. Animals could reproduce and increase a household's resources. A well-built house could shelter children who had not yet been born when its walls were first raised. These changes did not immediately create private property in the modern sense, and early farming communities organized ownership in many different ways. Some resources may have belonged to households, some to wider kin groups, and some to the settlement as a whole. Even so, permanence made it possible for certain people to hold more food, animals, tools, or access to productive land than others. Once resources could be accumulated, they could also influence who worked, who rested, who married, who moved, and who received support during illness or pregnancy. The body entered this new social structure through daily differences that might be small at first. A household with many animals could provide more milk, meat, hides, or exchange value, but it also required more labor. A family with better land might harvest more reliably, while another struggled with poorer soil or greater distance from water. One woman might have relatives nearby who helped with food preparation and childcare. Another might carry the same responsibilities with little support. One man might spend much of his time managing animals or distant fields, while another worked for a household that controlled fewer resources. Farming did not divide bodies only through sex. Wealth, age, kinship, household size, and local authority could all shape physical experience. Yet these forces could overlap with gender in ways that made male and female lives increasingly different. If land passed mainly through one line of descent, marriage could determine where a woman lived and whose household received her labor. If animals or tools were controlled by certain men, boys might be drawn into those activities earlier. In another community, women may have held important rights over land, stored food, or household production. Archaeology does not support one universal model. What it reveals is that resources capable of being inherited gave social arrangements more lasting effects. A temporary shortage affects the body for a season. Unequal access repeated across generations can influence childhood growth, adult strength, dental health, fertility, and survival. The long human beginning had always depended on cooperation and sharing, but mobile life limited how much could be stored or defended in one place. Farming expanded that possibility. Grain in a storage pit could represent security, obligation, status, or control. A herd could provide food and mobility, but it could also mark difference between households. Permanent houses made family continuity visible in the landscape. These developments did not automatically produce severe inequality, and many villages may have remained relatively balanced for long periods. Still, the foundation had changed. Material advantage could now remain after one person died. It could shape the lives of descendants who inherited both resources and responsibilities. Men's and women's bodies therefore began to reflect not only different tasks, but also different positions within households and lines of descent. The agricultural system reached the skeleton through work and diet, yet behind those immediate pressures stood a deeper change. Some parts of daily life had become durable enough to outlast the individual body and organize the next generation before it was born. Where a person lived after marriage could shape nearly every part of daily life, including work, food, support, movement, and exposure to risk. In some farming communities, a woman may have moved to live near her husband's relatives. In others, a man may have joined the woman's household, or couples may have formed a new residence apart from both families. These arrangements were not fixed across the ancient world, and they could change over time within the same region. Yet wherever people settled after marriage, the decision affected more than family connection. It placed the body inside a particular network of labor and resources. A woman entering an unfamiliar household might have less immediate support from her own relatives during pregnancy, illness, or childcare. Another woman living among sisters, mothers, and aunts might share daily tasks more easily. A man who remained close to inherited land could gain stable access to fields and animals, while another who moved into a different household might have fewer rights or different responsibilities. Kinship therefore became a physical condition as well as a social one. It influenced who helped carry water, who shared stored food, who watched children, who worked distant fields, and who received care during recovery. Access to food could also follow these relationships. A household controlling fertile land, livestock, or large stores might provide more reliable meals than one with fewer resources. Yet distribution within the household could still vary by age, status, labor, pregnancy, illness, or custom. Men and women did not simply eat according to biological need. They ate within systems of obligation. A person expected to perform heavy work might receive a larger share. A nursing mother might be given special foods in one community and no additional support in another. Children of one lineage might have stronger claims to stored grain or animals than people who had married into the household. Archaeology rarely reveals these rules directly, but differences in diet, mobility, burial treatment, and childhood origin can sometimes suggest that people were not all born and raised in the same place. Chemical evidence from teeth may indicate that some individuals moved into a settlement later in life, while burial patterns can show whether newcomers were treated similarly to local residents. Such evidence must be interpreted carefully, because movement does not automatically reveal marriage, and burial difference does not prove inequality. Still, it helps show that farming communities were built from networks of people whose bodies entered the village under different conditions. The long human beginning had always depended on kinship, but settled life made kin relations more closely tied to land, houses, stores, and inherited responsibilities. A person's place within the family could determine not only whom they belonged to, but where they worked and what support remained available during periods of weakness. These arrangements could deepen differences between male and female bodies when one sex moved more often, inherited resources differently, or carried obligations that followed marriage. Yet no single pattern explains all farming societies. Some communities may have been relatively equal. Others may have concentrated power and food within particular lines of descent. The important change was that social position could become repeated across generations. A daughter might inherit both access and limitation. A son might inherit both land and labor. Through these durable relationships, the structure of the household entered the body quietly, shaping nutrition, movement, recovery, and risk long before any written law described who was entitled to what. Farming did not automatically create patriarchy, and it did not produce the same form of inequality in every community. The appearance of stored food, inherited land, livestock, and permanent houses created new possibilities for power, but possibility is not the same as inevitability. Some farming societies may have remained relatively balanced for long periods, with labor shared flexibly and resources distributed through broad kin networks. Others gradually developed stronger differences in authority, inheritance, residence, and access to food. These changes could favor men in one region, women in another, or particular families regardless of sex. The evidence does not support one moment when agriculture suddenly placed all men above all women. Social structures emerged slowly from local histories, and they could change when population, climate, warfare, trade, technology, or marriage patterns changed. This caution is important because bodily difference is not the same as social inferiority. A woman with heavily loaded arm bones may have performed demanding work, but the skeleton cannot reveal whether that labor gave her respect, obligation, independence, or hardship. A man buried with tools or weapons may have held status, but those objects do not prove that all men shared his position. Even unequal diets require careful interpretation. If one group received more animal food, the difference might reflect privilege, work requirements, ritual rules, seasonal movement, or access to particular landscapes. Archaeology can identify patterns, but the social meaning behind those patterns often remains uncertain. The long human beginning had never depended on isolated individuals. Survival required cooperation between people of different ages, skills, and physical abilities. Farming increased this interdependence because crops had to be planted and harvested at the right time, food had to be processed, animals required care, and children had to be raised while all other work continued. A rigid system that ignored illness, pregnancy, injury, or changing household size could not function without adjustment. Even where gender roles became strong, actual daily life may have remained more flexible than formal expectations suggest. Men could take on work near the household. Women could travel, herd, trade, cultivate, or manage stored resources. Older people could perform tasks that required experience rather than strength. Children could enter different forms of labor gradually. The division of work was therefore shaped by practical need as well as custom. Over time, however, repeated customs could become durable structures. If sons inherited land more often, boys might grow into roles tied to fields, animals, and authority. If daughters moved after marriage, girls might grow toward lives shaped by relocation, household labor, and new kin obligations. If women controlled food processing or household stores, that responsibility could bring influence as well as workload. If men controlled exchange or livestock, mobility could become linked to male status. None of these arrangements was universal, and none can be read directly from bone alone. Yet when social expectations were repeated through generations, they could begin shaping childhood, movement, nutrition, and recovery before adulthood. Farming changed bodies differently not because biology dictated one permanent social order, but because communities organized necessary work in different ways. Some arrangements became unequal, others remained cooperative or changed repeatedly. The agricultural world created conditions in which gender could become more deeply connected to labor, property, inheritance, and residence, but people still made those connections through local choices and traditions. The history preserved in male and female skeletons is therefore not evidence of one unavoidable outcome. It is evidence that social structure, once repeated long enough, could become physical. Farming did not change men's and women's bodies through crops alone. The deeper transformation came from the entire system that formed around cultivation. Fields altered movement, stored food altered diet, permanent houses altered disease exposure, herds altered travel and injury, pregnancy and nursing altered the way female bodies balanced energy, work, and recovery. Property and inheritance altered who received support, who moved after marriage, and who gained access to certain resources. None of these forces acted separately. They entered the body at the same time and combined in different proportions across a lifetime. A man who walked long distances with animals might also suffer from a narrow diet, carry heavy loads, and grow up during periods of infection. A woman who spent years grinding grain might also work in fields, carry water, nurse children, and move to a new household after marriage. Their skeletons could preserve differences, but those differences were the final result of many overlapping pressures rather than one simple division of labor. This is why there was never one male farmer and one female farmer. There were men and women living in dry valleys, river plains, forests, highlands, wetlands, and coasts. Some depended strongly on grain. Others combined crops with fishing, herding, hunting, or gathering. Some lived in small settlements with limited social difference. Others belonged to larger communities where land, animals, and stored food became increasingly unequal. A pattern found in one place may disappear in another because the route from field to body was never the same. Even within one village, age, health, family position, wealth, and personal history could matter as much as sex. Two women might share the same biological capacity for pregnancy, yet experience completely different workloads, diets, and support. Two men might belong to the same farming population while one traveled widely and the other remained near houses and workshops. The long human beginning had produced a species capable of living through flexibility. Farming did not remove that flexibility, but it placed people inside systems that repeated the same obligations more regularly. The body now had to respond not only to weather and movement, but to schedules created by planting, harvesting, storage, animal care, food preparation, and household responsibility. These schedules could be divided along lines of sex, but they could also be divided by age, skill, status, or need. Over generations, repeated arrangements became physical patterns. Stronger upper limbs, changes in lower body mobility, differences in dental health, signs of childhood stress, injury, or recovery could emerge within the same community. Yet no single sign carries the whole explanation. Biology shaped how work was experienced, but society shaped who performed the work, who rested, who ate first, who moved, and who remained. Farming changed bodies differently because it reorganized daily life differently. Men and women did not receive agriculture as an abstract invention. They received it through soil, tools, meals, childbirth, illness, kinship, and labor. The transformation was therefore both biological and social. It was written not only in fields and villages, but in the uneven ways human bodies were asked to sustain them. The differences created by farming did not always appear in the same part of the body. In one community, the clearest contrast between men and women might be found in the arms, suggesting different patterns of repeated upper body work. In another, the legs might reveal more about mobility, walking distance, or the use of uneven terrain. Elsewhere, the strongest difference might appear in the teeth, where decay, wear, or tooth loss reflected changes in food, preparation, age, or biological demand. Some populations may show contrasts in adult height, childhood growth, injury, or signs of physiological stress. Others may show very little separation at all. This variation is not a weakness in the evidence. It is one of the most important parts of the story. Farming did not act on human beings as one uniform force. It reached the body through local conditions, and those conditions were never identical. A village built beside a river created different demands from one located on dry ground. A community dependent on grain did not organize daily work in the same way as one that combined gardening, fishing, herding, and gathering. A settlement where water was close reduced one form of carrying, while another where fields or pastures lay far away increased daily travel. The tools used to grind, cut, dig, or transport materials also changed how force entered the body. Men and women therefore could show different skeletal patterns in one place and more similar patterns in another, even when both communities depended on cultivated food. The long human beginning had prepared our species for variation rather than a single way of living. Farming continued that pattern, though it placed people inside more permanent routines. These routines could strengthen differences when labor was divided consistently by sex, age, or household role, but where tasks were shared more widely, where resources were distributed more evenly, or where movement remained flexible, the physical gap between male and female bodies might remain smaller. This is why one dramatic finding should never become a universal claim. Strong female arm bones in one region do not prove that all prehistoric women performed the same work. Reduced male mobility in another population does not prove that all men became less active. Higher rates of dental disease among women in one cemetery do not establish a rule for every farming society. Each pattern must be read beside local evidence of diet, tools, settlement design, animals, burial practice, and age. Even then, uncertainty remains because archaeology preserves only fragments. Some bodies are never buried in recoverable places. Some graves are destroyed. Some bones decay before they can be studied. The surviving sample may reflect only part of the community. Age can further complicate comparison because older people have had more time to accumulate joint damage, tooth loss, and injury. Childhood conditions can influence adult bone strength long before adult labor begins. What appears to be a difference between men and women may partly reflect differences in age, health, migration, or social position. The clearest conclusion is, therefore, not that farming changed every male body in one direction and every female body in another. It is that agriculture created systems capable of producing different physical outcomes. Those outcomes depended on who moved, who carried, who ate what, who gave birth, who cared for others, who controlled resources, and who had time to recover. In some places, the differences became visible in bone. In others, they remained faint or disappeared entirely. The history of farming bodies is not a single pattern. It is a map of many local lives shaped by the same broad transformation in unequal and unpredictable ways. The history of farming is often told as the story of abundance. More food could be produced from the same land. Grain could be stored, villages could grow, children could survive in greater numbers, and communities could remain in one place long enough to build houses, paths, fields, and traditions. Yet abundance at the level of the settlement did not guarantee ease at the level of the body. The same system that supported more people could demand longer repetition, narrower diets, heavier caregiving, denser living, and greater dependence on harvests that might fail. Men and women entered that system through different mixtures of work, movement, reproduction, illness, kinship, and access to resources. Their bodies therefore did not change according to one simple law. Some differences may have grown because labor was divided. Others may have reflected pregnancy, nursing, childhood nutrition, migration, age, or disease. In some places, male and female skeletons followed clearly different patterns. In others, the contrast was small. The lesson is not that farming harmed one sex and benefited the other, nor that every early village organized life in the same way. The deeper lesson is that human progress is never measured completely by how much a society can produce. A fuller measure must also ask how the work was distributed, who had time to recover, who received varied food, who faced repeated risk, and whose labor remained invisible. This does not turn farming into a mistake. Cultivation allowed communities to survive in new ways, support larger populations, and create forms of knowledge that reshaped the human future. But every new system also creates new demands. The first farmers gained stored food and permanent homes while taking on repetitive labor, crowded disease environments, and social arrangements that could become more fixed across generations. Their descendants inherited both the benefits and the burdens. This is why the bodies beneath early villages matter. They remind us that history is not only preserved in walls, tools, seeds, and monuments, it is also preserved in growth interrupted during childhood, in joints repeatedly loaded, in teeth altered by daily meals, and in the uneven ability of bodies to heal. These traces do not speak with perfect clarity, but they make one point difficult to ignore. A society can become more productive without improving life equally for everyone inside it. That insight remains valuable far beyond the ancient world. It encourages us to look beneath large achievements and ask how they are carried by individual people. It also asks us to treat uncertainty honestly. Archaeology cannot recover every task, every meal, or every decision. It cannot tell us exactly what one woman felt while grinding grain or what one man believed while walking beside a herd. What it can do is reveal patterns, test explanations, and show that biological difference was shaped by social life rather than existing apart from it. It also reminds us that bodies are not passive surfaces on which culture writes a simple message. They adapt, resist, compensate, weaken, and recover according to conditions accumulated over an entire life. Two people may live beside the same field and still carry different versions of that field within them, because one began labor earlier, one endured more illness, one received greater support, or one passed through demands the other body could never experience. Farming changed human bodies because it changed the organization of survival. Men's and women's bodies changed differently where that organization gave them different work, different risks, different nutritional demands, and different chances to rest and recover. Yet the pattern was never universal, and the meaning was never complete. When human beings began shaping the land to support their bodies, how much did the new shape of society begin shaping those bodies in return?